I'm going to let people in. And admitting all.
Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Good to see everyone today. We're going to give about a minute to see if we can get more folks joining us today. Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am the Executive Director of SB at Home, and my name is Regina Celestin Williams. And we are so excited to host you for a thoughtful conversation around the City of San Jose's tenant preference policy proposal and provide information which may be useful for advocacy for similar policies in other communities throughout Santa Clara County. Policy in Action at Home is a monthly informal brown bag discussion convening housers to engage on hot housing topics. Every month, we select a topic or current event, bring in an expert to give a brief presentation, and then open up the discussion to ask questions, float new ideas, and identify potential areas for shared action. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamian Nation, and Ama Mutsun, on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the Indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Emily Ann Ramos, who's going to provide you with a few ground rules. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Regina. Hi, my name is Emily Ann Ramos. Welcome to our tenant preference policy PIA. So some ground rules. We want to ensure that the conversations and relationships here today remain respectful and productive. So please be kind and courteous to each other, and no rude comments or personal attacks. We encourage asking questions and listening as we learn and engage with each other. Please keep comments and questions focused on a tenant preference policy proposals, and keep questions and chat on topic. Sometimes the chat can get a little lively, and if you find that distracting you from the content of the discussion, we encourage you to consider closing the chat temporarily. So feel free to stop slides, Riva, and I'm going to introduce our main speaker for today, which is Josh Itsumatsu. I'm spotlighting you now. There we go. Okay. So Josh Itsumatsu is the acting division manager for the City of San Jose Housing Department, working on policy and the Housing and Community Development Commission. Josh has over 25 years experience working in affordable housing and community development, mostly from the nonprofit side. He's a third generation San Josean and works and is working for the City of San Jose, specifically San Jose and not any other city right now. And that was one of his childhood ambitions. He's a parent of 2 teenagers, so please be kind. So with that, Josh, take it away. And I believe, Reva, you have the slides up. Josh, are you muted?
It looks
Oh.
like he might have dropped off.
Oh, he's back in. I think he got accidentally disconnected. Where'd he go?
Sorry about that, everybody. I think I got dislodged somehow. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So
And we cannot see you.
There we go.
okay,
I'm going to spotlight you again.
sorry about that. So good afternoon on a Friday afternoon, everyone. My name is Josh. And as Emily so generously introduced me, I'm with the City of San Jose Housing Department, and I'll be talking about the disparate impact analysis for the City of San Jose's anti-displacement tenant preferences, which is quite a mouthful. So next slide, please. It's probably not a good sign when a presentation starts with a disclaimer, but here we are. So I'll say that when I was pitched to do this presentation, I was told to expect that there would be a number of people in the audience from other jurisdictions who might be thinking about whether or not San Jose's version of tenant preferences would be something that'd be applicable in their cities, your cities. And I was told, that it'd be appropriate, should I choose to do it, to talk about the technical methodology of how we develop these policies. So as opposed to other presentations that we've done in other venues about tenant preferences, this one will be leaning more into like the methodology to develop the policy, and less about the finer details of the policy, or about the implementation of the policy. So this is going to be wonky, but hopefully not too wonky of a presentation, in the weeds, but just the right amount of weeds. Next slide, please. So broadly, tenant preferences, as we are defining the term, is to set aside a portion of restricted affordable apartments. So this is formally covenanted, publicly funded affordable housing that would otherwise be available to the general population. These units would be set aside for a particular population that is narrower than who would otherwise qualify for those units. So any other sorts of qualifications around income, et cetera, still apply. But it would just be a narrower population. For example, there are tenant preferences for school employees, right? That's not what we're talking about here today, but just as an example. So next slide, please. Before I get into the wonky, but not too wonky presentation, a few words about the history of this and why we are trying to do these preferences. Because of our current housing crisis, because of our racist history, lower income renters, and disproportionately communities of color are being displaced from the city of San Jose. So sort of driven by the community, in 2020, the city passed a set of policy and program proposals called the Citywide Residential Anti-Displacement Strategy. And tenant preferences, to have local tenant preferences, anti-displacement tenant preferences, was one of the priority strategies in this anti-displacement strategy document. So this is something that we at the city have been working on since 2020, including passing a state law, working with community members and our political Sacramento representatives to pass a state law last year, SB 649, sponsored by Cortese, to declare that people who are at risk of being displaced are a legitimate subpopulation to be able to be served in affordable housing. So the effect of this is to make anti-displacement tenant preferences, like what we're trying to create, in a general sense, legal to use with the low-income housing tax credit and with tax-exempt bond financing. One important thing to note here is that making this category of people at risk of being displaced, a legitimate subcategory to be served in affordable housing, this does not trump fair housing. And so that a local jurisdiction who wants to apply this type of tenant preferences would still need to make appropriate findings that whatever anti-displacement tenant preference that they create would, in addition, not violate fair housing, which is this is really a motivating factor for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So next slide, please. So in the city, San Jose, we are proposing two different anti-displacement tenant preferences. And again, these are for city-supported, income-restricted, affordable housing. The first is what we're calling a citywide anti-displacement preference, so that anyone who otherwise qualifies for affordable housing and lives in a census tract where displacement is happening or likely to happen, these folks will qualify for a preference to live in affordable housing any place in the city. The second preference is a neighborhood preference. So a portion of units would be set aside for people who live in the same council district as the subject affordable housing building. So we are proposing that a total of 35% of units be used for these preferences, with 15% for the neighborhood preference and 20%, so together 35% for the citywide anti-displacement preference. So next slide, please. So both of these preferences are essentially geographic in nature. So for the anti-displacement preference, again, this is for people who live in a neighborhood where displacement is happening or the neighborhood is at risk of displacement. And so for that, we're using as a starting block census tracts, and census tracts that are defined where displacement is happening, or displacement is likely happening, or displacement is risk of happening, as defined by the UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project, or UDP. So these map designations come from the UDP. So it shows census tracts that are orange, red, and pink. These are census tracts where displacement is happening or is at risk of happening in the city of San Jose. For our anti-displacement, citywide anti-displacement preference, anybody who is lower income in these tracts, who lives in these tracts currently, would qualify for the preference. For the neighborhood preference, it's somebody who lives in a city council district where there is affordable housing in their city council district, right? So the city council districts are shown in brown and boundaries, brown boundaries, and they're numbered. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, even though we passed state legislation that declares people at risk of displacement a valid subpopulation to target for affordable housing, fair housing laws still apply. So broadly, any preference that is created cannot burden or benefit anybody on the basis of a protected class, which is under as defined by state or federal fair housing law. Intent in this case doesn't matter, or I guess I should say good or neutral intent doesn't matter. Bad intent would still something that would be legally actionable, but like it doesn't matter that on the face of it, the preference is the language of the preference is racially neutral, or doesn't mention sex or gender or anything like that. If it has a disparate impact, it has a different impact between different protected class population, That's what's important. It's the impact that matters. Next slide, please. So to be able to analyze or assess the likely impact of a proposed policy, we are supposed to do a disparate impact analysis. So it's basically to do a statistical analysis using something called the 4/5 test. So the original 4/5 test was developed by the EEOC to test employment discrimination, but this is something that has been also adopted by HUD to use in the context of housing discrimination also. And there are a couple other tests to look at, to look at or assess potential discriminatory impact that courts or HUD might also use, the Langlois test and the standard deviation test. But all of these tests rely on some base assumption around changes in the demographic results from the expected results for absent the policy or program versus the results with the policy or program being in place. And this is about the expected results with the policy must be within certain plus minus range, of what the expected results would be without the policy or program. For the 4/5 test, it's about being 4/5 similar or within 20% of the expected results without the proposed policy or program. So all of that's a lot. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna try to talk through this in a really schematic way. And we're going to the imaginary city of Smileytown. So Smileytown is 50% green smileys and 50% purple smileys. This means that for a hypothetical 100-unit apartment building in Smileytown, the expected result without a preference would be a building with 50 green smiley households and 50 purple smiley households. So applying a preference, we'd not want the expected number of units projected for either green smileys or purple smileys to change more than 20%. 20%. So this means that, of course, if the preference creates an expected breakdown of 50 and 50, of course that passes, right? But also, oh no, I'm still on the same, yeah. But also a 60-40 split, either way passes, as does a split between, anything between 60 and 40, so 59-41, for 58-42, etc. Like anything that is around the range of 60-40, 50-50, right? But anything outside of 60-40, where there's like either way, where it's 61-39 or 39-61 between green and purple smileys, anything where the expected results are more than 20% different from the projected results, it fails. So next slide, please. So like I mentioned earlier, our preferences are basically geographic in nature. So to talk about the next couple points, I created a map of Smileytown. So we have, next slide, please. So, if you created a preference that split Smileytown in half and advantage either East Smileytown or West Smileytown, it doesn't matter which, it would fail the 4/5 test because you would get something different than a 50, within the range of a 50-50 split, right? Next slide, please. But if you split Smileytown in half and advantage either North Smileytown or South Smileytown, it doesn't matter which, it would pass the 4/5 test, right? Next slide, please. And so, as you can see, depending how you draw and place a shape, you can have, the same shape or preference that passes in one part of the city. Next slide, please. So this is a mile, that was hypothetically a mile radius, but, you draw that same shape and place it in a different part of the city, you can have the same preference that doesn't pass, that fails. Next slide, please. And it's not just about the size of the shape or the shape of the shape, it's also the placement of the shape, right? So this circle is intended to be centered on the same center point as the previous circle that failed, but because it's bigger, and draws in more of the population and gets closer to the 50-50 or gets close enough to the 50-50, it passes. Next slide, please. So all of this means that when we do our testing of a preference, when we did our testing of a preference, we did a ton of different test runs for lots of different scenarios, trying to account for different variables. At last count, we've done 66 different scenarios, but each scenario we've done, it's like each scenario is 10 times that, right? Because we ran each scenario in every council district. And more than that, we also did different demographic classes, right? So we did different definitions of a neighborhood, 1 mile radius, 2 mile radius, the council district is what we eventually settled on. We did different percentage of the units that would be set aside for each preference. We did different mixes between the two preferences, with alone and in combination. And because we need census tract level data to run the different scenarios, we could only test protected class categories that are included in some form of US Census produced data product. So we could use race, seniors, disability, veteran status, female head of household, but other statistics are not tracked at a census tract level. So religion, as an example, sexuality, these are not things that we have data on, reliable data on at a census tract level. So it's not something we could test, the different shapes, the different geographies for. But we tested the preference, our preference projections against expected results using citywide expected results, countywide expected results, and MSA level expected results. Next slide, please. So some observations from all the analysis that we've done. So in order to pass the analysis, the pool of people created by the preference should be demographically similar to the larger population to the extent possible. That's pretty basic, but that's I mean, I think that's key. It's simple, but if you're creating preferences, you want to be, if you're going to pass the tests, it needs to be, the preference itself needs to be as similar, the pool of people it creates needs to be as similar as possible to the larger population that you're testing it against. So geographic areas, so if you create a geographic preference like what we've done, larger areas that have more people are more likely to be similar to the larger population. For example, we finally settled on city council districts because there are 100,000 people in each of the council district. But I should note that this, having a larger area that the preferences draw from, this is in tension with community expectations. It's in tension with what most people's notions are of what a neighborhood is, right? So a city council district is much larger than a neighborhood. But it's kind of what we needed to do to get the preferences to work, to pass the tests. So another observation is that what works in one jurisdiction won't necessarily work in another. So an example of this is that San Francisco has some similar preferences. They draw their radiuses to be much smaller than San Jose's, but San Francisco is more densely populated. So when they draw a smaller shape, it includes more people. So another observation is that in our county, in Santa Clara County, I mean, I don't know, I'm not, really familiar with doing this analysis in other places so much. So might be something that's true generally, but I know it's at least true for our area. Race is often the most sensitive or most determinative factor in what will pass or fail the disparate impact analysis. So it's that, you know, if something like disability is more even, persons with disability are more evenly dispersed throughout the county as opposed to people of different racial groups. So that, like, when we draw our different shapes and locate them in different parts of the county, looking at race is a harder thing to get past than any of the other demographic categories that we looked at when we were testing. And then for our specific you know, our specific preferences that we designed, the anti-displacement preference tests better than the neighborhood preference. So, you know, and this is because in our case, you know, the population of the total displacement area, if you remember back to the map, the reds, the orange, the green, well, I mean, sorry, the red, green, and pinks, the total displacement area is greater than any one council district, and it has more people than any one council district. So it draws in more people, and it is and these tracks are, you know, there's definitely concentrated in the center and the east side of the city, but there are tracks dispersed through the city. So it cuts across more of the city and pulls in a demographic mix that is more representative of the larger city, as opposed to what the demographics in different council districts are. Next slide, please. So some other factors that we considered in the design of the preferences. Passing the disparate impact tests was the most important thing, but other things that we tried to do included, you know, we wanted to maximize the size of the overall set aside. A higher percentage is better, and still pass the tests. We wanted to maximize the neighborhood preference to the extent possible because it was a harder preference to get to pass the test. It's something that the community said was really important. We wanted the preferences to apply uniformly across the city as much as possible. This is something that's about you know, the next point, which is also about the ease of implementation, but it's also about in sort of like the fair and equal application of a policy. But you know, we were thinking about, like, you know, what sorts of preference is going to be easier to administer over time. So, you know, one thing that we heard from San Francisco as an example is that they are constantly redrawing, you know, whenever there's a new affordable, they do a radius around an affordable housing project, so, or affordable housing building. And whenever they redraw that radius, they have to figure out all the census tracts that are in that radius. They have to upload all those census tracts to their version of doorway. They have to, you know, so it's just like they have like staff within their housing IT division that are dedicated to processing, you know, preference work, drawing new shapes and figuring out how these shapes intersect with census tracts. So this is actually quite a bit of work. And then finally, we were looking at flexibility to adjust to fit changing conditions. You know, these disparate impact tests are going to have to continually be passed and reevaluated over time. So you need some flexibility in your preference to be able to make adjustments to changing conditions over time. So next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of the different scenarios that we ran and some of the variation between scenarios, here's a table of pass fail for different scenarios with the mix of preferences applying to 40% of the units. If you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, I said that we are applying to a total of 35% of the units. So this is more than what we're doing. And the reason why it's more is because 40% actually fails in, in a bunch of different scenarios. So whether it's like 20% anti-displacement and 20% neighborhood preference, which is at the top, that fails across many council districts, or, down to like 40% anti-displacement and 0% neighborhood preference. I don't really actually know what's happening in the final row there. I think there might be a problem with one of our spreadsheets because, well, I don't need to get into this, but I need to double check something on what's happening on the final row there. But next slide, please. So what's up next for us? We've been working on this for a while. As I said, we just presented the draft. We've just been presenting the draft framework to the public, to different stakeholder groups, to our own Housing and Community Development Commission. This month, we're going to be doing some framework adjustments. We plan to follow up with some interested stakeholder groups, some smaller group conversations with people who identified specific issues about our current preferences. So some affordable housing developers and property managers, and also some community folks. For the last quarter of this year, November and December, we'll be seeking public approvals. We'll be going to our Community and Economic Development Committee of our City Council for its November meeting, and with the intent to go to City Council for approval of our proposal by December. In December, we'll be getting the tenant preferences uploaded into Doorway app, so that this is our online affordable housing portal. Next year, early next year, we'll be creating implementation materials and public information for distribution and education about the preferences. And also next year, we'll be holding property manager information sessions and present to community members near new affordable housing sites. So that's my presentation. I'll be available for discussion and questions, but I think Emily has a couple more slides to present before we get there.
Thank you. Spotlighting myself, and then I'm going to spotlight you. There we go. So Riva, if you can also share the next two slides I put in. We will be getting ready for questions, but to get ahead of some of the questions, I'm going to share a couple slides. One is a slide of the recent community asks that has been we've already this policy has already gone before HCDC, and it will be coming before other things. So these were the community requests, and Josh had addressed some of these and the issues that need to get worked through as we go through these requests. So there has been requests from the community to increase the percentage of eligible units to 40%. And Josh did talk about how what are the barriers to that, as he mentioned before, where they were running tests and variations of it has caused it to fail, essentially this fair housing test. That just means that it's something to be worked through, and the community will figure out how they want to address that, and the city will figure out how they could come together in doing this. Other requests, this is the main reason I'm showing this is largely to get ahead of some of the questions that people have asked too. And then some things like there's an ask from the community to accept alternative documentation for this application process, and I do believe that's something that the city is working on. To implement this policy, the city is using Doorways which is something that's going to have access. Is it going to be accessible for everyone in the Bay Area, essentially, Josh? I forgot.
Doorway?
Yeah, doorways.
Yeah, I mean, it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but doorway is intended to be region wide. It's about who's signed up so far, and there's coverage across a lot of the Bay Area. I don't know that it's comprehensive yet.
So they're hopefully as part of integrating these ideas of alternative documentation, it's one of these things that would probably be integrated in doorways. And then this third point, and this is a question that has been asked a few times ahead of time, is the work with the community to find and implement a displaced preference policy. So the tenant preference policies that we went over today, the two of them, was the neighborhood preference and the anti-displacement preference. These are people who currently these are the ones that currently are in these areas that are at risk of losing their homes, kind of thing. So you have those from the displacement tracks, and then you have those from the local preference. Both are very geographically placed. Once we start looking at a displaced preference, there could be based on past geographies, or something broader. Another concern that has been brought up with a tenant preference policy is we're looking at trying to reverse trends of past discrimination and redlining and racist policies that have caused displacement and dispersion. As a geographic tenant preference policy will work very well for certain communities, like the Latino community that is primarily around the East San Jose area that has been significantly impacted by gentrification and displacement. A geographical preference policy wouldn't affect or wouldn't be as helpful to for example, the Black community in San Jose, which is more spread apart and not as geographically concentrated. So as we look at future other preferences, that was a community request as we look into more preferences to help address systemic racism and displacement from that had been affected systemically. The next one is identify steady funding sources to support the implementation of the tenant preference program. That is something that demonstrates that the community wants to make sure that once this program is on and operating, that it continues to be on and operating. One of the examples that talked about displaced preferences, we're not looking at that quite in San Jose right now, although it doesn't preclude us from eventually doing it in the future. If you could go to the next slide, Reva. The city of Berkeley recently had a proposal, some of it got cut off, but that they brought forth to their city council that has a preference for displaced people. So I'm adding a D at that end. So people who have already been displaced from an area. And so these are some of the eligibility criteria that they have set up for theirs. And so that is something that we're putting out there so that people can understand the other possibilities of the different tenant placements. So now to some of the questions. We have a question. How long must a person have lived in a neighborhood to qualify for a preference?
So it's you live, if you live in a place that qualifies you for the preference and you can prove that you live there, you don't have to prove any duration, at least what we're proposing right now. You don't have to prove any duration of having lived there for, once you prove residence, that's good enough. I should note that, there has been suggestions that came up, even from our Housing and Community Development Commission, that we should look at applying some sort of sort of baseline requirement for maybe 3 years, 5 years, or whatever, that people have lived in where they've lived before. Our city attorney is telling us that there are potential constitutional issues with that. But we're in discussions to sort of evaluate that. I think that there's, there are some potential, enforcement issues with that as well. I don't know, implementation issues, but we're evaluating that right now, and we'll have a response later. Emily, you're muted.
Shoot, sorry. All right. Next question. How does the preferences interact with other restrictions from various funding sources?
So the preferences would be in addition to or on top of the restrictions from other funding sources. Restrictions from other funding sources would still apply. So the preference would be in addition to the funding sources. So, you would still have to qualify based on income, based on what other sort of legal characteristics are being, are conditions of living in the affordable housing.
Okay, and this one's more like a question relating to what you mentioned about San Francisco, how they have to do a new analysis every single time. The question was, it seems like drawing or redrawing the boundaries often like San Francisco does could really be confusing to people who may be in a neighborhood 1 month and out the next. Is there any way to provide more consistency and stability to residents who may qualify for tenant preference on the basis of neighborhood?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that we were thinking, that as opposed to drawing a new shape every single time, it's a lot more still not everybody knows what council district they live in, but it's a little bit more readily accessible. It's something that's probably easier to know without having special mapping program or something like that, whether or not what census tract you're in, or whether or not the census tract is inside or outside of a specified radius. It seems that's like easier for most folks to understand. So that was like another thing that was on the plus side when we were thinking about this, for census tracts versus, for council districts, as opposed to, census tracts or radius, or a shape that changes with every single different new property. That is a concern that we identified.
Great, and everyone, please make sure you keep put your questions in the chat. The next question we have is, does a tenant preference policy require a significant amount of money to implement?
It depends. No, basically no. I think that, the way that we're looking at it is that, there's the analysis that we have to do, which we've done. We would have to keep doing that analysis. So there's a little bit of staff time that's dedicated to continuing updating. The preferences would get uploaded into Doorway. So there's some work that goes with that. That's de minimis. And then there's ongoing sort of monitoring, enforcement of affordable housing in general. And like the tenant preferences would be added to the portfolio of things that we already look at with affordable housing. So, you know, affordable housing is a highly regulated enterprise. There are lots of things that you have to do to run affordable housing. You know, there's income certifications, there's lots of records that you have to keep, you know, there's affirmative marketing that you have to do. The tenant preferences would be folded into that work. So it would not be like a new area of work. It would be something that would be, you know, monitored by existing staff. So.
So as you were developing this policy, and this policy took a bit of time to develop, from when we did the anti-displacement policy or a strategic plan, basically the anti-displacement plan, and it was one of the items that was in that strategic plan. What were the largest barriers to develop in this policy? And if you had solved those barriers, what were those solves?
So one thing is what I talked about, the SB 649. So, you know, when we first started working on this, we got legal advice that that this type of preference would not be applicable to affordable housing development that use the low-income housing tax credit or tax-exempt bonds, because it was not identified under the IRS, you know, statutes, regulatory structure, that as a legitimate population, you know, that would need a preference. But one of the ways to get that is to have a state or government entity declare, state or federal entity declare that this is a population that is worth serving, you know, separately. So SB 649, in passing that, was a, you know, part of that included the states of California's declaration that this is a population worth serving. So it became eligible to use for low-income housing tax credits and for tax-exempt bond financing, which is, you know, for affordable housing, it's that those are like almost, you know, and for all intents and purposes, every single affordable housing development right now, you know, has tax credits or some form, you know, the tax exempt financing. So this is so that was really important for us to be able to apply the tenant preferences, to have that be a legitimate application. You know, moving forward, similarly, I think there's still an open question of whether or not the state HCD will approve the use of our tenant preferences on buildings which the state funds. So buildings which state HCD puts money into. So we have, as part of our work plan moving forward with this, that we are going to submit the disparate impact analysis to the state. This is something that in conversation that they've told us that they would want to see before they approve the use of tenant preferences on HCD funded properties. So, you know, funder by funder, or funding source by funding source for for affordable housing, you know, which is always uses layered financing, right? Every funder has to approve the application of the tenant preferences. So we are going to have to make our case with each of the funders. But fortunately, a key thing about that is the numbers, and you know, is the data analysis. And we think we've done a thorough job with the data analysis, and we can show that the tenant preferences that we're proposing, you know, don't disparately impact any population, and so therefore are would be legitimate to do.
Right. I think we are coming up on time. So first, I want to thank you, Mr. Josh, for joining us and sharing about the tenant preference policy in a little bit more of a wonkier way than my usual PIAs. So thank you for that. This is a very very hefty policy that the city of San Jose will be taking on. And I know that other cities were looking at this to see for their own communities as well, and if it was appropriate for theirs, and how San Jose does it versus how other cities will end up doing it. We don't know. So it'll be an interesting thing to see how that takes on. It'll be interesting to see how the city of San Jose moves forward. Like I mentioned before, the policy has already gone before HCDC, which is the Housing Community Development Committee.
Commission, yes.
Commission, yes. And soon it will actually be tentatively. We have some future dates if people are interested. It will go before CED November 27th tentatively. CED is a
I
community.
think that's on the schedule. That's for sure.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
And CED is Community Economic Development.
Committee, it's a committee of the City Council of San Jose City Council. Yes.
Yes, as opposed to HCDC, which was an advisory board committee.
Yes, it's HCDC is not made up of council members, and it is a body that is advisory to the City Council.
And then CED is actually a subcommittee of the current city council.
Yes, exactly.
Then it is tentatively set for council on December 12th. So we might actually have this all wrapped up by the end of the year.
That's our hope. That's our hope.
So for those of you who are interested more on this policy, we will send some follow-ups, emails, including the recording of this and the slides. And so keep that in your check that your emails for that. And be sure to check out on November 27th at CED and December 12th for council. We hope you enjoyed the event today, and we invite you to join us at the next Policy in Action. Our October Policy in Action will be the 2023 legislative updates. So you may have heard in the news, there were a bunch of bills passed, and some are currently waiting for the governor's signature, and by October we will find out whether the governor has signed some of these bills or not. And so we will get a full update of a bunch of housing bills that we were following. So I did see that in the chat there was some talk about ACA 1. The thing about constitutional amendments, they actually, once they're passed by the legislator, then it goes in front of the people, the voters. So that actually does not have to wait for a governor's signature for you to know what's going on with that. They'll need the voter support at that point. So finally wrapping up, we have a poll that Allison will be launching soon. And while she's doing that, we have our membership pitch. At SB at Home, we believe everyone deserves a safe and stable home. If you do too, we invite you to join us as a member. When you join SB at Home, we can leverage our resources, magnify our voices, and advance strategic collaborative solutions to California's affordable housing crisis that meet our local and regional needs. Your membership helps support our work, including programs like the Policy in Action today. You can find the link to join us in the chat. So together we can work towards solving the Bay Area housing crisis. So let's get that link in the chat. Bam. All right. And so thank you everyone for your time. Please make sure you fill out the poll before you exit out. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to get a little bit more in the weeds. Don't often get to do that in a public setting, so I do appreciate that.